Before we settle in, do me a small favor. If you enjoy slow, detailed history that doesn't rush you or shout at you, tap like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments how you usually listen to these videos. With your phone resting nearby, maybe the screen dimmed, let's ease into a world that movies made shiny, but reality made heavy, painful, and often disappointing. Tonight, we are stepping into the life of a medieval knight. Not the storybook version with banners snapping in the wind and heroic speeches before battle, but the real one. The one that smelled like sweat soaked into wool, iron rusting under rain, and old blood that never quite washed out. Being a knight sounded impressive when spoken aloud, especially to peasants who would never touch a sword. But for the person living that life, day after day, it often felt like a long list of obligations, discomforts, and risks that never really paid off the way the songs promised. Most knights did not begin their lives dreaming of glory. They began as boys handed over to another household, usually around the age of 7. If your family had land or connections, you might be sent away to serve as a page in a lord's home. This was not a gentle boarding school. It was training through obedience. You learned to stand quietly, to carry messages, to serve food, to clean up messes you didn't make. You slept where you were told, ate what you were given, and learned quickly that your body was not your own. It belonged to the household, to the lord, and eventually to the battlefield. As you grew older, the expectations grew heavier. By your early teens, you were a squire. This meant real labor. You carried armor that weighed more than a sack of grain. You cleaned weapons crusted with rust and dried gore. You learned how to strap plates onto another man's body while your fingers froze in winter or blistered in summer. You practiced riding horses that were expensive, temperamental, and dangerous. A bad fall could cripple you before you ever saw a battle, and there was no compensation for that. If your leg broke wrong, your future ended quietly. Knights were expensive projects, and not everyone finished. Armor alone could cost more than a small farm. Horses had to be fed year-round, even when wars were not being fought. Weapons broke, straps tore, and metal needed constant care. Most families who aimed to make a knight were already stretching their resources thin. This meant pressure. Failure wasn't just personal disappointment. It could ruin a family's finances. By the time a man was finally knighted, usually in his late teens or early 20s, the ceremony was brief compared to the years of labor behind it. A blessing, a sword tap on the shoulder, an oath sworn aloud. And then the real burden began. Being a knight was not a reward. It was a contract. You owed military service to your lord, sometimes up to 40 days a year, sometimes far more if things went badly. And they often did. Campaigns were not neat or seasonal adventures. You didn't march off to war and return before harvest like the stories suggest. Wars dragged on. Supplies ran low. Pay was inconsistent or non-existent. Many knights were expected to support themselves during service, which meant living off the land. That polite phrase usually meant taking food from villages that had very little to spare. Knights were feared not because they were noble, but because hungry armed men are unpredictable. Armor, so impressive in museums, was a daily misery. Mail shirts bit into the shoulders. Plate armor pinched, bruised, and trapped heat. In summer, men collapsed from exhaustion inside metal shells that turned sunlight into an oven. In winter, cold seeped through joints and numbed fingers until even holding reins became difficult. And armor was never truly comfortable. It rubbed skin raw, trapped sweat, and carried the smell of the last man who wore it. Despite popular belief, knights did not fight constantly. Much of their time was spent waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for a battle that might never happen. When fighting did come, it was fast, chaotic, and terrifying. Battles were loud, confusing, and brutally close. You could not see the whole field. You followed banners and shouted commands, hoping the man next to you didn't panic. Injury was almost guaranteed. Cuts became infected. Teeth shattered under blows. Concussions were common long before anyone understood them. A knight who survived battle often carried pain for life. There were no pensions. If you could not fight, you became a burden. Some knights turned to managing land if they had it. Others faded into obscurity, living off relatives or former favors. And then there was the constant pressure to behave according to ideals that few could afford to maintain. Honor, loyalty, restraint. These were easy words when sung by poets. Harder when your armor needed repair, your horse was lame, and your lord was late paying what he promised. Many knights took ransoms when they could, capturing enemies alive for profit. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Marriage did not necessarily make life easier. Knights were expected to provide, to protect, and to represent their family's honor. A poor harvest or a lost horse could throw everything into crisis. Wives managed estates while their husbands were away, hoping raids or unpaid taxes wouldn't ruin them before winter. Halfway through this story, I want to ask you something. When you picture a medieval knight, what image comes to mind first? Is it shining armor or exhaustion under a heavy helm? Let me know in the comments, because the gap between image and reality is where this story truly lives. Being a knight meant living inside risk. You risked your body, your finances, your reputation, and often your life, for rewards that were uncertain at best. Glory was rare, pain was common, and the silence after battle, when the wounded lay groaning and the dead lay still, was something knights carried with them long after the armor came off. And this is only the beginning of why, for many men who lived it, being a medieval knight truly sucked. If you're ready, tell me to continue, and we'll move deeper into the daily fears, quiet humiliations, and unromantic truths that define the knight's life far more than any heroic legend ever did. Once a man became a knight, daily life did not suddenly improve. In many ways, it became harder. Titles did not guarantee land, and land did not guarantee comfort. A surprising number of knights owned very little beyond their weapons and armor. They were what historians sometimes call land-poor nobles. Noble by law and custom, but living close to the edge of debt. A knight without enough land had to find ways to survive. Some served permanently in a lord's household, acting as enforcers, escorts, or administrators. This meant living under constant supervision, expected to be ready at all times. Others became what we might think of as freelance warriors, offering service wherever conflict appeared. This was dangerous in a different way. Loyalty mattered, and switching allegiances too often could mark a knight as untrustworthy. Once that reputation stuck, doors closed quickly. Food, something we take for granted, was a daily concern. Knights ate better than peasants, but not always well. Bread, thick stews, salted meat, and ale made up most meals. Fresh food depended on season and luck. During campaigns, diets worsened. Hard bread broke teeth. Meat spoiled. Water was often unsafe. Illness spread easily among groups of men living close together, sharing cups, bedding, and wounds. Sleep was another problem rarely mentioned in legends. A knight did not always sleep in a bed. On the road, he slept on the ground, in barns, or under makeshift shelters. Armor had to be kept close because surprise attacks happened. Sleeping lightly became a habit. Many men lived in a constant state of half-rest, never fully relaxed, always listening for movement or raised voices. Horses, the knight's most important tool, added another layer of stress. War horses were not just animals. They were investments. Training one took years. Feeding one took resources. Losing one in battle or to illness could ruin a knight financially. Horses could panic, stumble, or be deliberately targeted by enemies. Watching your horse fall meant more than losing mobility. It meant losing status and security in a single moment. Training never really stopped. Knights practiced constantly because skill faded quickly without use. This meant bruises, strained muscles, and accidents even in peaceful times. Jousting tournaments, often imagined as glamorous sports, were extremely dangerous. Men died regularly in what was supposed to be controlled competition. Armor failed. Lances splintered into deadly shards. A single mistake could end a career or a life. Honor culture made everything heavier. Knights were expected to respond to insults, defend reputations, and uphold family names. This could drag them into feuds that lasted generations. Refusing a challenge could brand a man a coward. Accepting it could mean death over a careless word. Pride became a trap. You could not easily step away without consequences. Religion played a constant role in a knight's mind. Violence and faith lived side by side. Knights were taught that their role was divinely sanctioned, especially during crusades or holy wars. At the same time, they feared damnation for the blood they spilled. Confession, prayer, and donations to the church became ways to balance this fear. Some knights funded chapels or went on pilgrimages, not out of peace, but out of guilt. Women in a knight's life often bore unseen burdens. While knights were away, wives ran estates, negotiated disputes, and protected family interests. They had to be strong and careful. A mistake could cost land or invite attack. If a knight died, his widow's future depended on laws, relatives, and luck. Some were forced into unwanted marriages. Others entered convents because there were no better options. Violence was not limited to battlefields. Knights acted as local law enforcement. They collected taxes, enforced punishments, and suppressed revolts. This made them targets of resentment. Peasants feared them. Townspeople distrusted them. Respect was mixed with quiet hatred. Knights were symbols of power, and power always attracts anger. As years passed, bodies wore down. Joints stiffened. Old injuries flared in cold weather. Teeth rotted. Eyesight faded. There was no concept of retirement. A knight who could no longer fight had to rely on family, charity, or church positions if he was lucky. Many ended their lives poorer than they began, their sacrifices remembered only in fading records. Midway through this long story, I want you to pause for a moment. Imagine carrying responsibility without rest, danger without reward, and pride without security. If this challenges what you thought being a knight meant, let me know in the comments. Your perspective helps shape how these stories are told. The truth is, being a medieval knight was less about glory and more about endurance. Enduring discomfort, enduring fear, enduring expectations that never truly lifted. And as we continue, we'll see how war itself, the thing knights were built for, often delivered the cruelest disappointments of all. War was the reason knights existed, yet it was rarely the clean test of courage shown in stories. For most knights, war meant long stretches of boredom broken by moments of absolute terror. Armies moved slowly, roads were poor, supplies unreliable, and communication almost non-existent. A knight could spend weeks marching through mud, rain soaking through wool and leather, armor chafing skin raw, only to turn around and go home without ever seeing the enemy. When battles did happen, they were nothing like choreographed clashes of equal opponents. Confusion ruled everything. Dust filled the air. Horses screamed when injured. Men shouted orders that could not be heard over metal striking metal. You often had no idea what was happening beyond a few feet in front of you. Survival depended less on bravery and more on luck, positioning, and whether the man beside you lost his nerve. Knights trained to fight mounted, but many battles forced them to fight on foot. Horses were targeted deliberately, and once a knight was down, his heavy armor became a liability. Standing up after falling could be nearly impossible without help. Enemies swarmed fallen men, stabbing through weak points in armor. Death was rarely quick or noble. It was close, personal, and ugly. Fear was constant, even if it was never spoken aloud. Knights were expected to project confidence, but inside they felt the same dread as any soldier. Fear of pain, fear of capture, fear of dying far from home, unnamed, unremembered. Some men froze in battle, others fled. Cowardice was punished harshly, but panic does not care about rules. Capture, often seen as preferable to death, carried its own horrors. A captured knight could be ransomed, but only if someone was willing and able to pay. Until then, he lived as a prisoner, sometimes treated decently, sometimes brutally. Conditions depended entirely on the captor. Some prisoners were chained, others were paraded as trophies. If ransom negotiations failed, captivity could last years. Not all warfare involved open battle. Much of it was raiding, burning villages, seizing food, destroying crops. Knights participated in these actions not because they enjoyed cruelty, but because starving the enemy was a strategy. Still, the psychological toll was heavy. Many knights lived with the memory of civilians screaming as their homes burned. This was not something songs liked to mention. Sieges were even worse. They dragged on for months. Disease spread through cramped camps. Food shortages became desperate. Knights stood watch for endless hours, waiting for something to happen. When walls were finally breached, the resulting violence was uncontrolled and terrifying. Looting, killing, and chaos followed. Knights who tried to restrain their men were often ignored. Weather added another layer of misery. Rain turned camps into swamps. Heat caused dehydration and heatstroke under armor. Cold froze fingers and toes, sometimes leading to amputation. There was no shelter from these conditions. Campaigns did not pause for comfort. And then there was the aftermath. Survivors limped away carrying scars both visible and invisible. Friends were gone. Equipment was damaged or lost. Promised rewards were often delayed or quietly forgotten. A victorious campaign did not guarantee wealth. Sometimes it barely covered expenses. Knights were expected to maintain the image of honor even after participating in brutality. This contradiction weighed heavily on many. Some coped through religion, others through drink, a few through writing, leaving behind letters and chronicles that hint at exhaustion and doubt beneath formal language. As the years passed, repeated exposure to violence hardened many knights. Compassion dulled, patience thinned. This made them more effective in war, but more dangerous in peace. Conflicts at home often escalated quickly when men trained for battle tried to solve civilian problems with force. When war ended, a knight did not return to comfort. There were no victory parades waiting in most towns. No guaranteed rewards. No time to heal properly. A knight returned home older, often injured, and usually poorer than when he left. Armor needed repairs. Horses needed rest or replacement. Debts that had piled up during months or years away still waited patiently. For knights who owned land, peace meant administration. That sounds calm, but it was anything but. Fields needed tending. Tenants argued over boundaries. Taxes had to be collected without pushing people into revolt. Local disputes, many of them violent, required judgment. A knight was expected to be both warrior and ruler, even if he had no real training in governance. Mistakes could spark feuds that lasted generations. For land-poor knights, peace was worse. Without war, there was no employment. A knight without a patron was a dangerous thing, trained for violence but given no place to use it. Some drifted between households, offering service for food and lodging. Others turned to banditry, becoming the very threat they had once sworn to fight. Medieval records are filled with complaints about armed men roaming the countryside, former knights included. Injuries that were manageable during youth became unbearable with age. Old sword cuts reopened in cold weather. Joints stiffened from years of riding and armor. Back pain became constant. There were no surgeons as we understand them today. Treatments involved cauterization, herbal poultices, prayer, and hope. Many knights lived in chronic pain that never truly faded. Mental scars were just as real, though no one had words for them. Nightmares were common. Sudden noises triggered panic. Silence felt unnatural after years of camp life. Some knights struggled to adjust to quiet domestic spaces. They had learned to live alert, suspicious, always ready to react. Peace demanded patience they no longer had. Honor followed them home like a shadow. Past actions were remembered, sometimes twisted by rumor. A knight who lost a battle might be blamed regardless of circumstances. One who survived while others died might face quiet resentment. Reputation mattered deeply, and once damaged, it was nearly impossible to repair. Marriage, often delayed by war, brought its own pressures. Knights were expected to produce heirs, manage households, and protect family interests. Love was not always part of the arrangement. Marriages were political tools, binding families together through obligation rather than affection. A mismatched union could turn daily life into a cold, tense negotiation. Religion offered comfort but also anxiety. Knights were taught that violence was sometimes necessary, even holy, yet they still feared judgment. Many donated land or wealth to the church, hoping to secure salvation. Some joined religious orders late in life, trading armor for robes, seeking peace they never found on the battlefield. Social isolation was another quiet burden. Knights lived between worlds. They were above peasants but often below great lords. They belonged everywhere and nowhere. Courtly life demanded refined manners and constant performance. A wrong word spoken to the wrong person could end a career. Silence became a survival skill. Tournaments continued during peacetime, partly to maintain skills, partly to display status. But they were expensive and dangerous. A knight might go into debt just to participate, hoping for prize money or recognition. Injuries sustained there could be just as severe as those from war. As time wore on, the realization set in for many knights that their sacrifices would not be remembered. Songs favored kings and great heroes. Lesser knights faded into obscurity. Their lives left behind little more than worn weapons and scattered records. The promise of legacy, so often used to motivate them, rarely came true. If you're still listening, take a moment to think about this. How many people today are drawn into roles by promises of honor or recognition, only to find quiet struggle instead? If that thought resonates, feel free to leave it in the comments. Even whispered reflections matter here. Being a medieval knight was not a steady climb toward glory. It was a long balancing act over debt, danger, and expectation. Peace did not heal wounds. It simply revealed them. And as we move forward, we'll see how age, changing warfare, and shifting politics slowly pushed knights toward an uncertain and often disappointing end. Medieval warfare did not stay the same forever. As years passed, the battlefield slowly changed, and knights felt it before anyone else. Infantry tactics improved. Longbows, crossbows, and later early firearms made armor less reliable. A knight who once dominated a battlefield suddenly found himself vulnerable to a peasant with a bow standing hundreds of feet away. This shift was deeply unsettling. Everything a knight had trained for since childhood began to lose its value. Older knights struggled to adapt. Learning new tactics was not easy when your body already hurt every morning. Reflexes slowed, vision blurred, reaction time suffered. Younger men noticed. Lords noticed too. When choosing who to send into danger, commanders often preferred fresh bodies over experienced ones. Experience mattered, but not enough to stop an arrow. For many knights, this was the most humiliating part of life. They had built their identity entirely around martial skill. To be sidelined, ignored, or quietly replaced felt worse than injury. Some tried to prove themselves through reckless bravery, taking unnecessary risks in battle. This often ended badly. Others withdrew, accepting lesser roles that offered safety but little respect. Economic pressure never disappeared. In fact, it grew worse with age. A knight who could no longer fight effectively struggled to justify his position. Land income might shrink due to poor harvests, war damage, or disputes. Medical costs such as they were added strain. Supporting children, arranging dowries, and securing inheritances became constant worries. There was no safety net. Knights who served directly under powerful lords fared slightly better, but even they were replaceable. Loyalty was valued, but usefulness mattered more. A knight who could not ride fast or fight hard became an advisor at best, a burden at worst. Court politics were dangerous. Younger rivals competed for attention, favors, and positions. One wrong move could undo decades of service. Social expectations did not soften with age. Knights were still expected to maintain dignity, hospitality, and generosity. Guests had to be fed, appearances maintained, armor kept in good condition even if rarely worn. Poverty had to be hidden behind formality. Many knights lived lives that looked stable from the outside but were quietly collapsing within. Family relationships were complicated. Sons trained to become knights themselves, repeating the same cycle. Fathers felt pressure to encourage them, even if they knew the reality. Daughters were married off to secure alliances, sometimes against their wishes. Emotional distance was common. Affection existed, but duty often overpowered it. Illness became more frequent. Infections that a young body might survive became deadly. Tooth infections spread to the brain. Minor wounds turned fatal. Medical knowledge was limited and often harmful. Bloodletting weakened patients. Herbal remedies worked sometimes, failed often. Pain was simply endured. Death was never far away, and knights knew it intimately. They prepared for it through wills, donations, and confessions. Many worried deeply about their souls. Had they killed too much? Had they served just causes? These questions lingered in quiet moments, especially at night. Despite everything, some knights found moments of peace. Teaching younger men, managing land competently, attending church regularly. These were small victories, not grand ones. Contentment, when it came, was quiet and fragile. But many never found that peace. They lived long enough to see their world change and their place in it shrink. The skills that once defined them became outdated. The respect they expected faded into polite acknowledgement. And the stories sung about knights grew even more exaggerated, even further from lived reality. As knights aged and the world shifted around them, another quiet frustration set in, one that cut deeper than physical pain or fading strength. It was the realization that the story being told about them was no longer theirs. Society remembered knights not as tired men with aching joints and unpaid debts, but as symbols, clean symbols, useful symbols, and symbols do not reflect reality, they replace it. By the later medieval period, the image of the knight had hardened into legend. Poets, chroniclers, and court writers reshaped knightly life into something smoother and more heroic than it ever was. Tales focused on courage, loyalty, romance, and divine purpose. The long hours of boredom, the fear, the compromises, the moral confusion, and the quiet suffering were pushed aside. These stories were comforting, especially to those in power. They justified wars, reinforced social order, and gave meaning to sacrifice without addressing its cost. For living knights, this created a strange disconnect. They were expected to live up to an ideal that had little to do with their daily experience. Courtly behavior, elaborate manners, and polished speech became just as important as fighting ability. A knight was judged not only by what he did, but by how well he performed the role others expected of him. One misstep, one moment of anger or weakness, could damage a reputation built over decades. This performance extended into court life. Courts were not places of rest. They were pressure chambers filled with gossip, rivalry, and constant observation. Knights had to navigate complex social hierarchies, flatter the right people, avoid offending powerful figures, and conceal their own frustrations. Silence was often safer than honesty. Many learned to speak carefully, say little, and reveal nothing of their true thoughts. The rise of chivalric codes added another layer of strain. These codes emphasized protection of the weak, courtesy toward women, and restraint in violence. While noble in theory, they clashed with reality. War still required brutality. Law enforcement still involved force. Knights were caught between expectation and necessity. When actions conflicted with ideals, guilt followed, even when there was no alternative. Romantic expectations were especially unrealistic. Knights were portrayed as refined lovers, skilled in poetry and gentle devotion. In reality, many marriages were arranged, distant, or tense. Emotional openness was not encouraged in men trained for war. Expressing vulnerability could be seen as weakness. This left many knights emotionally isolated, unable to share doubts even with those closest to them. Education, often limited in youth, became another disadvantage. Some knights learned to read and write, but many relied on clerks and priests. This dependence left them vulnerable to manipulation. Contracts, debts, and legal disputes could spiral out of control simply because a knight could not fully understand the documents involved. Power did not always come with knowledge. Religion continued to shape how knights saw themselves. Sermons praised holy warriors while warning against sin. Confession offered relief but also reinforced fear. A knight might confess killing in battle and be told it was justified, yet still feel unease. The line between righteous violence and sinful bloodshed was never as clear in practice as it was in doctrine. As time passed, some knights withdrew from public life. They retreated to rural estates, managed what land they had, and avoided court politics. This isolation brought peace to a few, but loneliness to many. Social bonds weakened. Old comrades died or drifted away. The shared experiences of youth became memories with no one left to share them. Others clung to relevance by attaching themselves to rising powers. They served new lords, new kings, or new causes, even when it meant abandoning old loyalties. This was often judged harshly by historians, but survival sometimes demanded flexibility. Ideals did not feed families. The next generation of knights faced even greater contradictions. They were trained on stories of perfect heroes while living in a harsher, more crowded world. Competition increased. Resources shrank. Opportunities narrowed. Many young knights never achieved the status they were promised. They remained squires longer, served without reward, or died before making any mark at all. Violence at home increased as central authority weakened in some regions. Knights became embroiled in local conflicts, feuds, and power struggles that had nothing to do with honor. These fights were personal, bitter, and often pointless. Winning did not bring glory, only more enemies. Through all this, the myth grew stronger. The farther reality drifted from the legend, the more tightly society clung to the legend. It was easier to admire an ideal than confront the cost paid by real people. Knights themselves sometimes participated in this myth-making, telling selective stories, emphasizing victories, hiding failures. It was a form of self-defense, a way to make sense of lives that had demanded so much and given so little in return. In the quiet moments, when armor hung unused and swords dulled, many knights reflected on the path they had taken. Some felt pride, others felt regret. Most felt a complicated mix of both. They had done what was expected of them. They had endured, and yet the world they helped build remembered them not as they were, but as it wished them to be. This gap between lived experience and remembered story is one of the most painful legacies of the medieval knight. It stripped individuals of their truth while preserving their image. And as we move further forward, we will see how this distortion followed knights even beyond their deaths, shaping history in ways that still influence how we imagine the past today. As knights approached the later stages of their lives, another quiet reality settled in, one that no training prepared them for and no legend ever mentioned. It was the slow narrowing of their world, not through sudden disaster but through gradual loss. Loss of strength, loss of influence, loss of certainty. The world did not collapse around them, it simply moved on. Political landscapes shifted constantly in the medieval period. Alliances changed, dynasties rose and fell, and loyalties that once seemed unbreakable became inconvenient. A knight might swear his life to a lord, only to watch that lord lose power or land. When that happened, the knight's position weakened instantly. Loyalty was praised in theory, but survival often demanded adaptation. This placed knights in painful moral territory, forced to choose between honor and practicality. Many knights found themselves serving rulers they did not fully trust or believe in. Orders were followed because refusal meant exile, poverty, or death. This created internal conflict. A knight trained to see himself as righteous now carried out actions that felt politically motivated rather than morally justified. Over time, this eroded the sense of purpose that once sustained them. Legal systems were another source of frustration. Knights were expected to enforce law, yet law itself was inconsistent and often corrupt. Justice depended on status, wealth, and connections. A knight might be ordered to punish someone he believed innocent, or protect someone clearly guilty. Refusing could end a career. Complying damaged conscience. Either choice carried a cost. As centralized power slowly grew in some regions, kings sought to limit private warfare. This reduced the independence of knights. Feuds that once would have been settled through force were now controlled by royal courts. Knights were transformed from autonomous warriors into regulated servants of the state. This shift reduced violence overall, but it also stripped knights of authority they had long relied upon. Weapons technology continued to advance. Polearms, pikes, and disciplined infantry formations made individual martial skill less decisive. Battles became more about coordination than personal valor. Knights were still present, but they were no longer the unquestioned center of warfare. This change was subtle at first, but deeply unsettling. Identity built over generations began to fracture. Some knights tried to adapt by emphasizing leadership rather than combat. They trained men, organized defenses, and managed logistics. This required patience and planning, skills not always emphasized in youth. Those who succeeded found a new sense of usefulness. Those who did not felt increasingly irrelevant. Economic inequality within the knightly class widened. Wealthy nobles consolidated land and power. Lesser knights struggled to compete. Tournaments became spectacles dominated by those who could afford the best equipment and training. Merit mattered less than resources. The promise that skill and bravery could elevate a man rang hollow. Family pressure intensified. Knights were expected to secure their lineage in an increasingly competitive world. Arranging advantageous marriages became harder. Dowries grew larger. Social mobility narrowed. Failure to provide stability for one's children felt like a personal failure, even when causes were beyond control. Old friendships faded. Men who once shared battlefields now lived far apart or served different masters. Letters were rare. Travel was slow. Community shrank. Loneliness became common, though rarely acknowledged. Knights were expected to be self-reliant, to endure without complaint. Admitting isolation was not acceptable. Illness took more companions than war ever had. Plagues, fevers, and infections swept through towns and countryside alike. Knights were not immune. In fact, frequent travel and exposure often increased risk. Watching strong men weaken and die from unseen forces challenged beliefs about strength and divine favor. Faith offered explanations, but not always comfort. Some believed suffering was a test. Others feared punishment. Prayer became routine, sometimes sincere, sometimes desperate. Religious rituals structured life, marking time as bodies slowed and futures narrowed. Memory became a refuge. Knights revisited moments of youth, of purpose, of belonging. These memories were sharpened by contrast with the present. The past felt clearer, simpler, even when it had not been. This nostalgia was both comforting and painful. As society increasingly relied on written records, knights who could not read or write felt further marginalized. Decisions were made on paper, sealed in wax, debated in councils. Physical strength mattered less than literacy and persuasion. A lifetime of training did not prepare knights for this shift. Gradually, many accepted that their role was ending, not just individually but collectively. The world no longer needed knights in the way it once had. This realization did not arrive dramatically. It seeped in slowly, through small humiliations and quiet exclusions. Yet even as their relevance declined, expectations remained. Knights were still judged by old standards. They were expected to embody ideals that no longer matched reality. Living inside that contradiction required constant adjustment, quiet compromise, and emotional endurance. By this stage, being a knight was less about action and more about memory. About holding onto a sense of self while the structures that once supported it dissolved. And as we move forward, we'll see how this fading role shaped not only individual lives, but the way entire societies chose to remember, romanticize, and misunderstand the medieval knight long after the last sword was set aside. As the knight's place in the living world slowly diminished, another transformation was taking place beyond his control. His life, his struggles, and his compromises were being reshaped by others into something cleaner, safer, and far more useful for the future. This was the moment when the knight began to disappear as a person and reappear as an idea. After many knights died, what remained of them was rarely the truth of their lives. Families preserved what was convenient. Lords preserved what reinforced loyalty. Chroniclers preserved what supported political power. What was written down favored victories, obedience, and sacrifice. Failures, doubts, and moral conflict were left out. The lived reality of exhaustion, fear, and regret did not serve the needs of those telling the story. Monuments and tombs played a role in this transformation. Stone effigies showed knights lying peacefully, hands folded, faces calm, armor polished. These images suggested serenity and honor, not years of pain or struggle. Even knights who had died violently were remembered as if they had simply gone to sleep. The physical truth of death was erased in favor of dignity. Family memory was selective as well. Children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories that explained status and privilege. Hard truths were softened. If a knight had served cruel masters or fought questionable wars, those details were reframed as duty. If he died poor or broken, that was rarely mentioned. Memory became inheritance, and inheritance demanded justification. The church shaped remembrance in powerful ways. Funerary sermons emphasized repentance, faith, and salvation. Violence was framed as necessary, sometimes even holy. Knights who donated land or wealth to religious institutions were praised, regardless of how that wealth was obtained. This reinforced the idea that a knight's soul could be cleansed through ritual and generosity, easing discomfort over a violent life. Literature amplified these changes. Stories of chivalry spread through courts and towns alike. Knights became moral examples, models of bravery, restraint, and loyalty. These stories were not meant to deceive. They were meant to inspire. But inspiration requires simplification. Complex lives do not fit easily into verse. As these stories spread, they fed back into reality. Young boys trained to become knights based their expectations on fiction rather than experience. They believed skill and honor would bring recognition. They believed loyalty would be rewarded. When reality failed to match those expectations, disappointment followed. Yet the stories remained, unchallenged and unchanged. This cycle benefited those in power. Idealized knights made it easier to demand sacrifice. War became noble again. Suffering became meaningful. Questioning authority became dishonorable. Knights themselves sometimes clung to these ideals because abandoning them meant admitting that much of their pain had been unnecessary. Even historians of the time contributed to the myth. Chronicles often relied on noble patrons for support. Writing honestly about exploitation or failure could be dangerous. Safer narratives focused on kings, battles, and divine favor. Lesser knights were mentioned only when useful, disappearing entirely if their lives did not fit the pattern. Women, too, played a role in memory. Wives preserved family honor. Widows managed estates and told stories that protected children's futures. Mothers encouraged sons by repeating ideals that had shaped their husbands' lives. This was not deception. It was survival within a rigid social structure. Over time, the knight as a lived role faded, but the knight as a symbol grew stronger. Armor hung in halls long after it was used. Swords became heirlooms rather than tools. Lineages were traced proudly back to men whose daily struggles were forgotten. What remained was shape without substance. This transformation had consequences beyond memory. It influenced how future societies understood violence, authority, and duty. The knight became a template for heroism, used again and again in different eras. The costs were rarely included. For the men who lived these lives, this shift was bittersweet. Being remembered as noble felt validating. But it also erased the reality they had endured. Their doubts, compromises, and quiet suffering were buried under stone and story. As time passed, fewer people remembered what it truly took to survive as a knight. Fewer understood the weight of armor, the fear before battle, the disappointment after peace. The idea replaced the experience completely, and in that replacement, something essential was lost. The truth of human endurance, of flawed choices made under pressure, of lives lived not as heroes but as people. As we continue, we'll look at how this idealized memory influenced the next generations, and how the myth of the knight began to shape expectations not just of warriors, but of society itself, long after the medieval world had begun to fade. As the knight's image solidified into legend, its influence reached far beyond the men who had once worn armor. The idea of the knight began shaping how entire societies thought about duty, obedience, and sacrifice. And in that process, the original human cost of knighthood became even harder to see. Future generations grew up surrounded by knightly ideals without understanding their origins. Children heard stories of bravery and honor long before they understood war or loss. Nobles used these stories to justify their position, claiming descent from noble warriors whose sacrifices had earned lasting authority. The knight became proof that power was earned, not inherited, even when inheritance was exactly how it worked. This myth had practical uses. Kings and lords leaned on knightly ideals to encourage loyalty. Service was framed as sacred. Obedience was dressed as honor. Questioning orders became moral failure rather than reasonable concern. The language of chivalry softened the reality of exploitation. It made unequal systems feel righteous. The military consequences were significant. As warfare evolved, new soldiers were still taught old ideals. Discipline and hierarchy were wrapped in the language of knightly virtue. Even as armor disappeared and armies professionalized, the moral framework remained. Courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were still praised, while fear, doubt, and refusal were condemned. This carried a psychological cost. Soldiers in later eras struggled with the same tension medieval knights had faced. They were expected to endure without complaint. Pain was to be hidden. Emotional struggle was weakness. These expectations did not begin in modern times. They were inherited, shaped by centuries of romanticized warfare. Gender roles were also influenced. Knights were presented as protectors, reinforcing ideas about masculinity that valued strength, restraint, and dominance. Vulnerability had no place in this model. Men learned to suppress fear and sadness. Women were cast as dependents or inspirations, rarely as full participants in the reality of conflict. Social class hardened under the weight of knightly mythology. Nobility claimed moral superiority based on imagined ancestral virtue. Those without lineage were excluded from power regardless of ability. The idea that some people were naturally suited to lead because of blood and tradition became deeply rooted. Even justice systems reflected these values. Mercy was praised when granted by the powerful, not demanded by the weak. Violence was excused when carried out by those with authority. The knightly past was used as precedent, shaping law and punishment long after knights themselves had faded. For the few remaining knights living into this transformed world, the disconnect was painful. They recognized the stories being told did not match what they had lived. Some spoke quietly against them. Most stayed silent. Challenging myth threatened stability, and stability mattered more than truth. Over time, the knight became less a figure of history and more a moral lesson. A simplified example used to teach obedience, courage, and loyalty. Complexity was stripped away. Humanity was removed. What remained was a symbol that could be shaped to fit any agenda. This shaping continued through art, literature, and education. Painters depicted noble scenes. Writers emphasized virtue. Teachers repeated lessons without questioning origins. Each repetition pushed reality further away, yet traces of the truth survived. In letters, legal records, and personal accounts, historians later found hints of fatigue, fear, and frustration. These fragments reveal men caught between expectation and reality, doing their best within limits they did not choose. Understanding this does not mean rejecting ideals entirely. Courage and loyalty can be meaningful, but when ideals erase cost, they become dangerous. They encourage sacrifice without care, obedience without accountability. The medieval knight's greatest legacy may not be armor or swords, but this unresolved tension between myth and reality. It shaped how societies ask individuals to give themselves to causes larger than their own lives. As the shadow of knighthood stretched into new centuries, the role itself did not end with a single moment or decision. It dissolved slowly, unevenly, leaving behind fragments that lingered in law, culture, and personal identity. For the men who still carried the title, this slow unraveling was often more painful than a sudden end would have been. By the late medieval period, armies were changing in structure and purpose. Kings began to rely less on feudal obligation and more on paid soldiers. Mercenaries, professional infantry, and standing armies became increasingly common. This shift undercut the foundation of knighthood. Service was no longer a sacred duty tied to land and honor. It was a contract negotiated and compensated in money. For knights, this change struck at the heart of their identity. Many had been raised to believe their value came from loyalty and lineage, not wages. Being paid like a common soldier felt degrading, even when it was necessary. Yet refusing payment meant being excluded from warfare altogether. Pride and survival collided, and survival usually won. Armor, once a symbol of status and protection, became a liability. As weapons improved, heavier armor slowed movement without offering certainty. Knights who clung to tradition found themselves exhausted and vulnerable. Those who adapted shed pieces of their armor, abandoning visual markers of identity in favor of practicality. This physical stripping mirrored a deeper loss. Training systems changed as well. New soldiers were drilled as units rather than individuals. Discipline replaced personal valor. Orders mattered more than initiative. Knights who had been trained to fight independently struggled in these formations. The skills that once defined excellence now caused friction. The economic consequences were severe. Maintaining knightly status was expensive. Horses, armor, servants, and appearances still mattered socially, even as military value declined. Many knights went into debt trying to maintain an image that no longer served them. Selling land became common. Once sold, it was rarely recovered. Some knights sought relevance through administration. They became tax collectors, judges, or estate managers. This required literacy, numeracy, and political skill. Those who adapted found stability, but often at the cost of respect from peers who viewed such work as beneath the sword. Others joined military orders or foreign campaigns, seeking purpose in distant conflicts. Crusades and border wars attracted men who no longer fit at home. These ventures were dangerous and uncertain, but they offered something familiar. Clear enemies, defined roles, and the illusion of honor. As the old system weakened, social tensions rose. Common soldiers resented knightly privilege. Nobles resented the erosion of their authority. Knights stood awkwardly between, blamed by both sides. They were seen as outdated by rulers and oppressive by peasants. Legal reforms further reduced knightly autonomy. Royal courts replaced local justice. Private warfare was restricted. Castles were dismantled or repurposed. The knight's traditional role as local enforcer faded. Authority became centralized, impersonal, and bureaucratic. Emotionally, this period was marked by uncertainty. Knights had been taught who they were and what they were for. Now those answers no longer applied. Reinventing oneself was not encouraged. Tradition discouraged flexibility, yet reality demanded it. Some found meaning in religion, entering monasteries or supporting church institutions. Others retreated into nostalgia, clinging to old stories and rituals. Tournaments, once training grounds, became theatrical displays of a past that no longer existed. The end of knighthood did not bring closure. There were no ceremonies marking the transition. Men simply aged into irrelevance or adapted quietly. Their sons pursued different paths, often with mixed feelings. Pride in heritage coexisted with relief at avoiding its burdens. What survived was the image. The knight lived on in symbols and stories, even as the social role vanished. This disconnect allowed society to celebrate ideals without confronting the suffering tied to them. By this stage, it becomes clear that knighthood did not fail because knights were weak or foolish. It failed because the world changed faster than identity could. The structures that supported knighthood eroded, leaving individuals to carry expectations that no longer matched reality. Toward the end of a knight's life, the question that weighed heaviest was no longer about battle or honor, but about meaning. What had all of this been for? This question did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, during long evenings when travel became tiring, when armor stayed on its stand for months at a time, when familiar names disappeared from memory because there was no one left to speak them. Death was an everyday presence in the medieval world, but for knights it carried a special weight. They had lived closer to it than most. They had caused it, witnessed it, escaped it, and sometimes depended on it. As youth faded, death stopped being an abstract possibility and became a personal certainty. Knights prepared for it in practical ways, but also struggled with it internally in ways few records fully capture. Many knights began to arrange their affairs carefully. Wills became detailed. Land was divided. Debts were acknowledged. Promises were recorded. This was not only about responsibility, but about control. In a life shaped by orders and obligation, this was one of the few moments where a knight could decide something entirely on his own terms. Religious preparation intensified. Confession became more frequent. Donations to churches and monasteries increased. Some knights funded chapels or altars in hopes that prayers would be said for their souls long after death. This was not empty superstition. In a world that believed deeply in the afterlife, these acts felt like insurance against eternal consequences. Yet faith did not erase doubt. Many knights wondered whether their violence would truly be forgiven. Clergy offered reassurance, but reassurance was easier to accept in theory than in memory. Faces returned uninvited. Moments replayed without context. The justification of war did not always quiet the conscience. Physical decline made reflection unavoidable. Pain became constant. Old injuries flared without warning. Walking grew difficult. Riding became dangerous. A fall that would have been laughed off in youth could now end a life. This fragility clashed with a lifetime spent believing in strength. Dependence was especially hard. Knights who had commanded others now relied on servants, wives, or children. Loss of independence felt humiliating. Asking for help did not come easily. Pride lingered even when the body could no longer support it. Family relationships often shifted during this stage. Sons took over responsibilities. Authority passed quietly, sometimes reluctantly. Fathers offered advice that was not always wanted. Generational tension surfaced. The world the sons lived in was not the one their fathers had known. Lessons learned through hardship did not always apply anymore. Some knights tried to pass on wisdom. They spoke less about glory and more about caution. They warned against blind loyalty, against assuming reward would follow service. These conversations were rarely recorded, but they mattered. They represented a private attempt to correct the myth, at least within the family. Others avoided such honesty. They repeated the stories they had inherited. They encouraged sons to seek honor as they once had. Admitting regret felt like betrayal, not just of ideals but of self. For these men, silence was easier than revision. Memory played strange tricks. The past softened at its edges. Fear dulled. Pain blurred. Victories felt larger. Failures shrank. This was not deception so much as survival. Remembering everything clearly would have been unbearable. As death approached, concern about reputation returned. How would they be remembered? What stories would survive? Many knights cared deeply about burial location, tomb design, inscriptions. These were final acts of storytelling, attempts to shape memory after life ended. The reality, of course, was that memory would do what it always did. It would simplify, it would select, it would serve the needs of the living, not the truth of the dead. Knights sensed this even if they could not prevent it. For those without wealth or status, the end was quieter. No monument, no chronicler, just burial in consecrated ground and fading mention. Their lives were no less demanding, but far less remembered. History does not distribute attention fairly. In the final days, what mattered most was rarely honor or legacy. It was comfort, familiar voices, the absence of pain, simple human presence. The same needs that define any life, stripped of ceremony. The long journey of knighthood did not end with triumph or disgrace. It ended the way most lives do, in stillness and uncertainty. And in that ending, the gap between the legend and the lived experience became widest of all. As we continue, we'll look beyond individual deaths and examine what truly remained after knights were gone. Not in stories, but in institutions, habits, and expectations that quietly shaped the world that followed. After knights passed from the world of the living, their influence did not vanish with them. It settled instead into structures, habits, and expectations that survived long after armor rusted and swords were put away. This influence was quieter than legend but far more durable. It shaped how power was organized, how violence was justified, and how obedience was taught. One of the most lasting remnants of knighthood was the idea that authority was proven through service and sacrifice. Even as feudal systems weakened, this belief lingered. Rulers continued to frame their power as something earned through protection, whether or not that protection truly existed. The language of duty remained useful. It made inequality seem purposeful rather than arbitrary. Military institutions absorbed knightly values and reshaped them. Discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty were preserved, while personal honor faded into symbolism. Soldiers were no longer bound by land or oaths of fealty, but expectations of endurance and obedience remained. The knight's mindset survived inside uniforms, drills, and codes of conduct, even when the title itself disappeared. Civil administration was also influenced. Knights had once combined military, legal, and social authority in one role. As states centralized, these functions split into separate offices, but the expectation that authority should be firm, decisive, and unquestioned carried over. Bureaucracy replaced the sword, but the moral logic behind command stayed familiar. Land ownership patterns reflected this legacy as well. Estates originally granted for military service became hereditary property. Families who had once justified wealth through protection now justified it through tradition. The original exchange faded from memory, but the result remained. Inequality rooted in knighthood hardened into social structure. Education absorbed selective elements of the knightly past. Young nobles were taught ideals of leadership drawn from chivalric tradition, even when their future roles had nothing to do with warfare. Courage, restraint, and loyalty were praised. Doubt and dissent were discouraged. These lessons shaped ruling classes for generations. Legal concepts of honor and reputation also carried knightly influence. Insults to status were treated seriously. Defamation laws reflected older concerns about honor. The idea that reputation could be worth violence or punishment did not disappear quickly. It evolved into new forms. Cultural memory continued to favor clean narratives. Complexity remained inconvenient. The suffering of knights was still rarely acknowledged, because acknowledging it raised uncomfortable questions. If even the honored warriors had struggled, what did that say about the systems they served? This selective memory allowed societies to celebrate stability without examining cost. It made hierarchy feel natural. It made sacrifice seem noble rather than coerced. The knight's image provided moral cover long after the reality had vanished. For ordinary people, this legacy was double-edged. On one hand, the decline of knighthood reduced private violence and local tyranny. On the other, centralized authority became more distant and less personal. Protection came from institutions rather than individuals, and institutions did not know faces. The church also carried forward aspects of knightly culture. Ideas about righteous struggle, moral discipline, and obedience to higher authority fit comfortably within religious frameworks. Even when warfare was condemned, the language used to describe spiritual struggle echoed martial ideals. Over time, romantic memory grew stronger precisely because direct experience faded. The fewer people remembered real knights, the easier it became to admire them. Distance made myth safe. Nostalgia filled the gaps where knowledge had been lost. This nostalgia resurfaced whenever societies faced uncertainty. During times of instability, people looked back to imagined eras of clear roles and strong protectors. The knight became a symbol of order in a chaotic world, regardless of whether that order had ever truly existed. Yet beneath this symbol, the human truth remained buried but not erased. In scattered records, marginal notes, and overlooked documents, historians later found glimpses of exhaustion, fear, and compromise. These fragments challenge the myth, reminding us that the past was lived by people, not ideals. The true legacy of the medieval knight is not found in armor displays or heroic tales. It lives in the assumptions we still make about leadership, sacrifice, and worth. It lives in the expectation that some should endure hardship so others can feel secure. As centuries passed and medieval society slipped fully into history, the knight did not disappear. Instead, he was reborn in new forms, shaped to fit the needs, fears, and fantasies of later generations. This rebirth was not accidental. It answered a deep human desire for clear heroes in a world that increasingly felt complex, impersonal, and difficult to control. During the early modern period, writers and thinkers began looking backward with nostalgia. The medieval world, once dismissed as rough and backward, was reimagined as a time of clarity. In this imagined past, roles were fixed, values were stable, and honor guided action. Knights became the centerpiece of this vision. They represented certainty in an age that felt uncertain. This revival had little interest in accuracy. The physical hardship of knighthood, the economic strain, the moral compromises, and the political manipulation were inconvenient details. What mattered was the shape of the story. Knights were transformed into moral archetypes, figures meant to teach lessons rather than reflect reality. Literature played a central role in this process. Romantic epics, poems, and later novels presented knights as disciplined, restrained, and purposeful. Inner conflict was allowed, but only in controlled, dramatic ways. Doubt was noble. Suffering was meaningful. Failure, when it appeared, led to redemption rather than quiet despair. These stories appealed strongly to societies experiencing rapid change. As cities grew, trade expanded, and social mobility disrupted old hierarchies, the knight symbolized order. He stood for a world where everyone knew their place, where authority was visible and personal, where strength was embodied rather than abstract. National identity also absorbed the knight. Emerging states used medieval heroes to construct shared pasts. Knights were recast as defenders of the homeland, even when medieval loyalties had been far more local and fragmented. Battles were reframed as national struggles rather than feudal disputes. The past was reorganized to serve the present. This process blurred lines between history and invention. Monuments were restored or altered. Traditions were revived or created outright. Pageantry replaced analysis. The knight became a costume that societies could put on when they wanted to feel rooted and unified. Education reinforced this simplified image. Children learned about brave knights long before they learned about taxation, famine, or plague. Moral lessons were easier to teach through heroism than through complexity. The knight became an early model of citizenship, discipline, and sacrifice. Gender expectations were strengthened in the process. The knight's image promoted a version of masculinity built on control, endurance, and readiness for violence in service of a higher cause. Sensitivity and hesitation were minimized. This model shaped how generations of men understood strength and responsibility. Women's roles were similarly shaped by this revival. They were cast as symbols of purity, inspiration, or reward. Their actual labor, influence, and endurance in medieval life remained largely invisible. The romantic knight required a simplified counterpart. As industrialization advanced, the knight's image adapted again. Factories, machines, and bureaucracies felt cold and dehumanizing. The knight offered warmth and individuality. He represented craftsmanship, personal honor, and face-to-face responsibility, even if those qualities had never been as widespread as imagined. Military traditions borrowed heavily from this imagery. Medals, uniforms, and ceremonial language echoed knightly symbolism. Soldiers were praised as heirs to medieval valor. This connection lent emotional weight to modern warfare, even as its scale and destructiveness far exceeded anything a medieval knight could have imagined. Entertainment amplified these ideas further. Theater, later film and television, presented knights as timeless heroes. Visual media favored shining armor and dramatic gestures. Dirt, fear, and exhaustion rarely made the cut. The more distant the past became, the cleaner it looked. This constant retelling created a feedback loop. The more knights were idealized, the more people believed they had always been ideal. Historical correction struggled to compete with emotional storytelling. Myths felt true because they were familiar. For historians, this posed a challenge. Revealing the ordinary suffering of knights often disappointed audiences. Reality felt smaller than legend. Yet understanding reality matters. It reminds us that systems built on sacrifice often hide their costs behind beautiful language. The medieval knight, stripped of myth, becomes something far more relatable. Not a flawless hero, but a human being navigating obligation, fear, pride, and survival. His story is not one of glory, but of endurance within a rigid structure. By the time the knight had fully transformed into a symbol rather than a living role, something subtle but important had happened. The suffering that once defined his daily existence had become invisible, and invisibility made repetition possible. When pain is hidden behind beauty, societies feel free to recreate the same demands under new names. To understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval knight, it helps to strip away everything added later and return again to the ordinary rhythm of life. Not the battlefield, not the ceremony, but the in-between days, which made up most of a knight's existence and carried the heaviest weight. A knight's life was defined by obligation long before it was defined by action. From childhood, there was no real choice. Birth decided destiny. Training began early, often before a boy fully understood what was being taken from him. Play was replaced with discipline. Curiosity was narrowed into obedience. Mistakes were punished not just as errors, but as moral failures. This training did not create confidence so much as pressure. Boys learned that fear was shameful and pain was expected. They learned to perform toughness even when terrified. Over time, this performance became habit, and habit became identity. By adulthood, many knights no longer knew how to separate who they were from what was demanded of them. Daily life offered little relief. Travel was constant and exhausting. Roads were dangerous, weather unforgiving. Sleep was irregular. Food was inconsistent. Comfort was temporary. Even in times of peace, a knight lived in readiness, always aware that a summons could arrive at any moment, pulling him back into danger. Financial anxiety never fully disappeared. Knights were not universally wealthy, despite popular belief. Many lived close to ruin, balancing the cost of equipment, servants, and social expectations against unreliable income. Falling behind was easy. Recovering was rare. Debt followed knights quietly, shaping decisions more than honor ever did. Violence was not an occasional act but a condition of life. Even when not fighting, the expectation of violence shaped behavior. Arguments carried risk. Travel carried threat. Authority was enforced through fear. This constant tension eroded patience and trust. It made kindness harder even when desired. The emotional toll was severe, though rarely acknowledged. Knights witnessed death up close and often caused it directly. There was no language for trauma, no space for grief. Loss was processed through ritual, if at all. Most often, it was buried under silence and duty. Friendships were intense but fragile. Bonds formed quickly under pressure, then shattered just as quickly through death, betrayal, or political change. Each loss made the next bond harder to form. Isolation grew slowly, unnoticed until it was deeply rooted. Family life offered limited refuge. Marriage was strategic. Affection existed, but it was constrained by duty and distance. Children were loved, but often raised at arm's length, trained to repeat the same path. Emotional warmth was present in moments, not in structure. Aging magnified every weakness in the system. As bodies failed, expectations remained. Knights were respected less for who they were and more for what they once had been. Usefulness determined worth. When usefulness faded, so did attention. Retirement was not a recognized stage of life. There was no moment when service ended cleanly. Knights simply lingered, adjusting downward, clinging to fragments of authority, watching the world reorganize itself without them. What made this existence particularly cruel was the absence of acknowledgement. Knights were praised for sacrifice but rarely protected from it. They were honored in death far more generously than they were supported in life. Their suffering was considered necessary, even noble, which meant it did not need to be addressed. This pattern did not die with knighthood. It survived because it worked. It allowed societies to demand endurance while avoiding responsibility for its cost. The knight was the early model of this exchange. Give everything, ask for nothing, and be remembered kindly later. Understanding this does not mean condemning individuals or erasing ideals. It means recognizing the human cost beneath them. The medieval knight was not a failure of courage or character. He was a product of a system that consumed people quietly while celebrating the image it produced. By this point in the story, it becomes clear that what truly made life unbearable for medieval knights was not any single hardship, but the way all of them overlapped without relief. There was never a clean boundary between duty and self, between violence and peace, between survival and honor. Everything bled together, and knights were expected to carry that weight without complaint. One of the most exhausting aspects of knighthood was the absence of personal time. A knight did not belong to himself. His body, skills, and even reputation were considered resources to be used by others. Lords expected availability at all times. The church expected moral obedience. Family expected protection and provision. Community expected enforcement and leadership. There was no space left over where a knight could simply exist without function. This constant demand created a quiet resentment that rarely surfaced openly. Knights were trained to suppress dissatisfaction, to interpret frustration as weakness. But suppression does not remove emotion. It stores it. Over time, this led to bitterness, sudden anger, or complete emotional withdrawal. These reactions were judged harshly, reinforcing the idea that the knight was failing personally rather than responding normally to an impossible situation. Honor culture made everything heavier. Every action carried symbolic weight. A poorly chosen word, a delayed response, or a perceived insult could spiral into conflict. Knights lived in a state of constant self-monitoring. Pride was necessary for survival, but it was also dangerous. Maintaining reputation required vigilance, confrontation, and sometimes violence that could have been avoided in a different system. Conflict resolution was rarely calm or fair. Legal processes existed, but they were slow, biased, and often corrupt. Knights were frequently pulled into disputes that had little to do with justice and everything to do with power. Refusing to participate could be interpreted as weakness or disloyalty. Participation often meant escalating harm. Knights were also trapped by comparison. Their worth was measured against others in visible ways. Equipment, horses, clothing, and household presentation all signaled status. Falling behind publicly was humiliating. Keeping up was expensive. This created an endless cycle of display that drained resources and energy. Even moments meant for celebration carried pressure. Feasts were performances. Tournaments were dangerous competitions disguised as sport. Religious festivals reinforced moral expectations. There was no environment where a knight could fully relax without risking judgment. Sleep was often poor. Anxiety, physical pain, and irregular schedules took their toll. Rest was interrupted by alarms, summons, or simple discomfort. Chronic exhaustion was common. Clear thinking suffered. Mistakes followed. Punishment followed mistakes. Health deteriorated quietly. There was little understanding of long-term damage. Joint pain, hearing loss, head injuries, and chronic infections accumulated. Knights were praised for endurance, which discouraged seeking help even when it was available. Many pushed themselves until collapse. The idea of choice was largely illusory. Knights could make decisions within narrow limits, but stepping outside expectation carried severe consequences. Leaving service, refusing orders, or challenging authority could lead to loss of land, exile, or death. The freedom celebrated in legend rarely existed in practice. What made this especially cruel was the internalization of blame. When knights struggled, they often believed it was their own failure. They had been taught that honor and discipline could overcome anything. Admitting that the system itself was harmful felt like moral collapse. Over time, this internal conflict reshaped personality. Some knights became rigid and cruel, enforcing the same standards on others that had damaged them. Others became withdrawn, emotionally distant, or fatalistic. A few rebelled quietly, bending rules when they could, offering mercy in small ways, finding humanity in moments that history rarely records. The social world offered little support for these quiet acts. Kindness did not earn reputation the way strength did. Restraint was praised in theory but often punished in reality. Knights learned that survival required contradiction, to believe in ideals while regularly violating them. As years passed, many knights felt trapped between pride and regret. They were proud of surviving, of providing, of fulfilling expectations. But they also wondered what had been lost. Youth, choice, peace, possibility. These questions did not have answers. They simply lingered. This is where the myth becomes most damaging. By remembering knights as fulfilled heroes, later generations erase the cost of that fulfillment. They turn endurance into destiny and suffering into virtue. The real knight's life becomes unrecognizable beneath the weight of admiration. Understanding this stage of the story brings us closer to the truth. Being a medieval knight did not suck because knights were weak or unlucky. It sucked because the role demanded total sacrifice while denying the humanity of the person making it. By the later stages of a knight's life, there was often a deep, quiet exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue alone. It was the exhaustion of having lived too long inside a role that never truly allowed rest. Even when battles ended and obligations slowed, the expectations remained, pressing down with the same weight they always had. Knights were expected to be examples, even when they were no longer effective. Younger men watched them closely, not to learn how to live but how to perform. Any sign of doubt or weariness risked being interpreted as weakness. This forced older knights to maintain appearances long after the strength behind them had faded. Pride demanded it. Society required it. The gap between internal reality and external image widened with age. Inside, many knights felt uncertainty, regret, and confusion. Outside, they projected certainty and authority. Holding these two states at once required constant effort. Silence became a skill. So did emotional distance. Sharing honest feelings risked destabilizing everything that had been built. This pressure affected how knights treated others. Some became harsher, enforcing rules rigidly because structure felt safer than ambiguity. Others became strangely permissive, offering leniency where they could as a form of quiet rebellion. Both responses were shaped by years of constraint rather than simple temperament. Violence left lasting marks that medieval language could not describe. Head injuries changed personality. Repeated exposure to bloodshed dulled empathy or intensified it unpredictably. Sudden anger, numbness, or despair were common, but they were interpreted as moral flaws rather than wounds. Knights blamed themselves for reactions they could not control. The absence of understanding made isolation worse. There was no shared framework for processing what they had lived through. Confession offered absolution, not healing. Prayer offered meaning, not relief. Companionship was limited by pride and fear of judgment. Many knights carried their experiences alone. Time itself became a source of pressure. Knights were expected to produce heirs, secure alliances, and preserve families standing before it was too late. Failure in these areas was seen as a failure of character, not circumstance. Anxiety about legacy intensified as opportunities narrowed. The world around them continued to change. New forms of authority replaced familiar ones. Written law replaced personal judgment. Bureaucracy replaced reputation. Knights who had once enforced order found themselves subject to it in unfamiliar ways. Navigating this shift was humiliating and confusing. Some tried to cling to relevance through tradition. They emphasized rituals, titles, and ceremony. Others abandoned these trappings altogether, focusing on practical survival. Both approaches were attempts to regain control in a system that no longer valued them equally. Memory became unreliable. Trauma reshaped recollection. Some events felt sharper than they had been. Others faded completely. Knights began to question their own past, unsure which memories were true and which were softened by time. This uncertainty undermined identity itself. Respect from others became inconsistent. Some younger men showed exaggerated deference out of obligation. Others dismissed older knights as relics. This unpredictability made social interaction stressful. Every encounter carried the risk of embarrassment. Even moments of quiet were uneasy. Without constant demand, some knights felt purposeless. Their sense of worth had been tied to service for so long that stillness felt like failure. Rest did not feel earned. Peace felt suspicious. The body, once trusted, became unreliable. Simple tasks required planning. Pain interrupted thought. Sleep was light and easily broken. These changes forced knights to confront vulnerability they had been trained to deny. Despite all this, moments of clarity did occur. Some knights reached a place of acceptance. They recognized the limits of their control and let go of the need to perform. This was rare and often came late, but it brought a kind of quiet dignity that legend never mentions. Others never reached this point. They remained caught between pride and bitterness, clinging to past status while resenting the present. This inner conflict consumed energy that could no longer be spared. What becomes clear here is that knighthood did not simply demand strength. It demanded the suppression of humanity. Over time, that suppression created cracks that no amount of discipline could fully contain. By the final stretch of a knight's life, something subtle but profound often happened. The struggle was no longer against enemies, systems, or expectations, but against silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence that settles when a person realizes that no one is really asking what their life was like, only what it meant to others. Knights spent decades being spoken about rather than listened to. As young men, they were praised as future protectors. As active warriors, they were discussed as assets or risks. As older men, they were referenced as symbols of tradition. At no stage were they encouraged to speak plainly about their own experience. The role did not include reflection. It included obedience. This created a strange end-of-life loneliness. Even when surrounded by family, servants, or fellow nobles, many knights felt unseen. Conversations focused on politics, inheritance, or reputation. There was little room for honest reflection on fear, doubt, or regret. Those topics disrupted the image everyone depended on. Knights who attempted honesty were often met with discomfort. Younger listeners did not want to hear that the path ahead was painful. Peers did not want to admit they felt the same. Families feared that such honesty would weaken legacy, so the truth retreated inward again. By this point, many knights understood that the legend would outlive them, not the reality. This understanding carried a quiet grief, not because they wanted fame, but because they wanted recognition of what had been endured. To be remembered accurately felt more important than being remembered grandly. This grief was intensified by comparison. Knights watched others live differently. Merchants, artisans, and scholars faced hardship too, but they often retained greater personal choice. Their identities were not entirely consumed by a single role. Knights recognized this difference late, when it was no longer possible to change paths. The idea of wasted potential surfaced frequently. Many knights were intelligent, observant, and capable of more than combat. Yet their training narrowed possibility early. Skills that might have flourished in another context were never explored. This realization was painful, especially when time felt short. Some knights attempted small acts of correction. They encouraged sons to pursue learning alongside martial skill. They supported monasteries or schools not just for salvation, but for education. These gestures were quiet and rarely acknowledged, but they mattered deeply to those who made them. Others tried to leave personal records, letters, notes, marginal comments in legal documents. These were not heroic tales, but practical observations and private thoughts. Many of these writings were lost. Some survived by accident. They reveal voices that sound strikingly modern in their weariness and clarity. As physical decline continued, dependence increased. Being cared for forced knights to confront vulnerability in its purest form. There was no honor in needing help, yet need was unavoidable. Accepting care required humility that training had actively discouraged. The body became a constant reminder of limitation. Pain shaped mood. Fatigue shortened patience. Memory failed unpredictably. These changes were frightening because they eroded the last sense of control knights had over themselves. Faith often intensified again, but in a quieter way. Not as public devotion, but as private questioning. Knights wondered less about doctrine and more about fairness. Had the balance between sacrifice and reward ever been just? Had obedience truly been necessary? These questions did not always seek answers. Sometimes they simply needed to be asked. What stands out most at this stage is not despair, but complexity. Few knights ended their lives believing everything had been meaningless, but few believed it had been fully worthwhile either. Most lived in between, holding pride and regret at the same time. This emotional complexity rarely appears in legend. Stories prefer clarity, heroes or failures, triumph or tragedy. The real knight's ending was neither. It was unresolved, human, and quiet. Understanding this final internal struggle reframes everything that came before. Knighthood did not simply extract physical labor or loyalty. It shaped inner lives in ways that lasted long after swords were set down. It limited language for pain, discouraged reflection, and delayed understanding until it was almost too late to act on it. As the voices of real knights faded into silence, what remained was not neutrality but permission. Permission for later societies to reuse the shape of knighthood without carrying its burden. The absence of testimony allowed the role to be repackaged endlessly, stripped of cost and filled with expectation. Silence became a tool. When people no longer remembered what it felt like to live inside the armor, they felt free to admire it. Armor became an object of beauty rather than a source of pain. Swords became symbols rather than tools designed to wound. The discomfort, the fear, and the moral compromise vanished from view, leaving only surface meaning. This made knighthood incredibly adaptable. It could be invoked to justify almost anything. Loyalty could be demanded without reciprocal care. Sacrifice could be praised without limits. Violence could be framed as protection rather than coercion. The knight became proof that enduring hardship without protest was noble. Institutions learned from this. Military organizations, governments, and even workplaces absorbed the same logic. Individuals were praised for resilience while systems avoided accountability. Suffering became evidence of character. Endurance replaced well-being as a measure of worth. The language surrounding service reflected this shift. Words like duty, honor, and calling were used to soften unequal exchanges. People were encouraged to give more than they received and to feel proud of doing so. Questioning this imbalance was framed as selfishness or weakness. This pattern repeated because it worked. It produced compliance without constant force, turned pressure into identity. People did not need to be controlled externally if they learned to control themselves internally. The medieval knight had been an early example of this mechanism. What made the knight especially effective as a model was his distance. He existed safely in the past, beyond correction. No living person could contradict the story. This allowed admiration without responsibility. It allowed people to inherit the image without inheriting the cost. Even historical study was influenced by this dynamic. For a long time, scholarship focused on battles, titles, and institutions rather than daily experience. This was not always intentional. Sources were limited, but the result was the same. Human suffering was secondary to structure and achievement. When historians did begin uncovering the more ordinary realities of knightly life, these details often felt disappointing to audiences. The truth did not match the romance. It lacked clarity. It lacked triumph. But that discomfort is precisely what makes it important. Because the real lesson of knighthood is not about bravery or honor. It is about how systems shape people and then forget them. How ideals can become tools. How silence can be mistaken for strength. The medieval knight was asked to endure contradictions that no individual could fully resolve. He was told to be violent and restrained, obedient and honorable, feared and admired. Failure to balance these demands was treated as personal weakness rather than structural impossibility. This framing protected the system. If a knight struggled, it was because he was flawed, not because the role was unsustainable. This belief discouraged reform. It also discouraged compassion. Over time, the same logic appeared elsewhere. Workers were praised for loyalty while being denied security. Soldiers were honored while being neglected afterward. Caregivers were celebrated while being exhausted. In each case, admiration replaced support. The knight's silence echoed forward. It taught societies that it was possible to extract enormous sacrifice while telling beautiful stories about it. That stories could be more powerful than truth. That memory could be curated to serve the present. Understanding this does not require rejecting the past. It requires listening differently, paying attention to what is missing, asking why certain experiences were never recorded or preserved. Silence is rarely accidental. If the medieval knight could speak freely across time, he might not demand condemnation or praise. He might simply want recognition of complexity, of effort given without guarantee, of lives shaped by duty rather than choice. The tragedy is not that knights suffered. Suffering is part of human history. The tragedy is that their suffering was turned into expectation for others, stripped of context and repeated. As we approach the closing stretch of this long reflection, the story becomes less about medieval history and more about patterns that persist. The knight's armor may be gone, but the logic that shaped it remains surprisingly familiar. As the final years of a knight's life approached, the world around him did not slow down to match his pace. Castles still needed defending. Land still demanded management. Lords still expected loyalty. The difference was that the knight now experienced all of this with a body that no longer cooperated and a mind crowded with memories that refused to stay quiet. Old age was not respected in the way stories suggest. It was tolerated when useful and ignored when inconvenient. A knight who could still give advice or command respect retained value. One who could not was quietly set aside. There were no formal retirements, no ceremonies of release. Service simply faded into expectation without reward. Many aging knights found themselves trapped between generations. Younger men viewed them as outdated. Lords viewed them as expensive. Peasants viewed them with a mix of fear and resentment shaped by decades of enforcement and taxation. Belonging nowhere fully, the knight's social world shrank. Daily routines became narrower. Travel was avoided when possible. Riding was painful. Long walks were exhausting. Armor became ceremonial rather than practical. Even wearing it briefly could leave joints swollen and breath shallow. Yet armor still hung nearby, a reminder of who the knight had been expected to be. Financial pressure increased with age. Medical care was crude and costly. Servants aged alongside their masters and became less reliable. Repairs to land and buildings could no longer be supervised personally. Knights depended more on stewards, relatives, or clergy, which introduced risk. Mismanagement, deception, and disputes became common. Legal conflicts consumed time and energy. Inheritance questions were rarely simple. Land boundaries were contested. Promises made decades earlier resurfaced unexpectedly. Courts moved slowly and favored those with influence. An aging knight without strong allies was vulnerable. The church became both refuge and reminder. Regular attendance brought structure and comfort, but sermons emphasized judgment as much as mercy. Knights were reminded constantly of sin, obedience, and repentance. Violence, once praised as duty, now required justification. This shift unsettled many. Confession was frequent, but it did not erase memory. Knights remembered screams, faces, and moments of fear, both theirs and others. The belief that righteous war excused everything was easier to accept in youth than in old age. Doubt crept in quietly. Social isolation deepened. Feasts became tiring. Conversations repeated themselves. Stories once impressive now sounded distant even to the teller. Friends died. Letters stopped arriving. The world grew smaller, quieter, and heavier. Family interactions carried tension. Sons had their own ambitions and frustrations. They respected their fathers but did not fully understand them. Advice was offered and ignored. Authority passed without acknowledgement. Watching this transition hurt more than expected. Wives often became caretakers, managing households while shielding their husbands from decline. This reversal of roles was difficult for men trained to command. Dependence felt like failure even when unavoidable. Physical decline brought fear not of death, but of indignity. Falling, forgetting names, needing help to dress. These were humiliations knights were not prepared for. Strength had defined worth for too long. Some knights sought solitude, retreating to small estates or religious houses. Others clung to ceremony, insisting on titles and rituals long after their substance had faded. Both responses were attempts to preserve identity. Memory became selective. Certain moments replayed endlessly, others disappeared entirely. Knights questioned their own past, unsure whether they had truly chosen their path or simply followed it. Death, when it came, was rarely dramatic. It arrived through illness, infection, or gradual weakening. The body gave way quietly. Final arrangements were made with care, not for glory, but for peace. Burial practices reflected status more than truth. Effigies showed calm faces and perfect armor. Inscriptions spoke of honor and service. Few mentioned exhaustion, doubt, or sacrifice without return. The medieval knight did not fade out in battle for most men. He faded out slowly, surrounded by symbols that no longer matched lived reality. His life closed not with triumph or disgrace, but with unanswered questions. And in those unanswered questions lies the real reason it sucked to be a medieval knight. Not because of war alone, but because the role demanded everything while leaving little space to be human. As the medieval world continued to turn, even after many knights had grown old or died, the consequences of their lives did not disappear. They lingered in households, in villages, and in quiet corners of the countryside where the effects of knighthood were felt most clearly by those who had lived alongside it. To understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval knight, it is necessary to look not only at the knight himself, but at the narrow space he occupied between power and obligation. Knights were often the most visible representatives of authority in everyday life. For peasants and townsfolk, the knight was not an abstract hero. He was the man who enforced rents, collected dues, settled disputes, and punished disobedience. This placed knights in an uncomfortable position. They were expected to protect the people, yet they were also responsible for extracting resources from them. Gratitude and resentment existed side by side. This tension shaped how knights were treated in daily interactions. Respect was formal, not warm. Fear replaced affection. A knight who showed mercy risked appearing weak. A knight who enforced rules strictly was disliked but considered effective. There was no option that allowed both humanity and security. Every choice carried consequence. Knights understood this contradiction, even if they rarely spoke about it. Many entered service believing they would be defenders of the weak. Over time, they realized that defense often meant maintaining an unequal system. This realization did not always lead to cruelty, but it often led to emotional withdrawal. Caring too much made the role unbearable. Life within a manor or small castle reflected this strain. Knights lived among servants, retainers, and laborers who depended on them but also watched them closely. Authority had to be maintained constantly. Familiarity was dangerous. Distance was safer. This limited genuine connection and reinforced isolation. Disputes were frequent and exhausting. Boundary disagreements, accusations of theft, inheritance conflicts, and unpaid dues filled a knight's days. Violence was not always the solution, but the threat of it underpinned every decision. Even peaceful resolutions relied on the knowledge that force could be used if needed. Knights were also caught between local custom and lordly command. A decision that satisfied villagers might anger a superior. Obedience upward often meant hardship downward. Refusal upward meant loss of favor or punishment. Knights absorbed blame from both directions. Seasonal cycles brought no rest. Harvest time required supervision. Winter brought scarcity and unrest. Bad weather led to hunger, which led to theft, which led to punishment. Knights were expected to manage these crises without additional resources. Failure was judged harshly. Economic strain deepened this pressure. When harvests failed or trade declined, income dropped but obligations remained. Knights were still expected to maintain appearances, provide hospitality, and equip themselves for war. Cutting corners risked reputation. Maintaining standards risked ruin. This constant pressure encouraged compromise. Knights accepted bribes. They overlooked violations. They favored allies. These actions were not born of greed alone, but of survival. Yet each compromise chipped away at the ideals knights had been taught to uphold. Over time, cynicism replaced idealism. Knights stopped expecting fairness. They focused on endurance. This shift was rarely acknowledged, but it changed behavior profoundly. Justice became procedural rather than moral. Duty became habit rather than belief. Religious life intersected with these struggles daily. Knights attended Mass alongside those they judged and punished. They prayed beside men they had fined or imprisoned. This proximity created discomfort. Faith offered structure, but it did not resolve contradiction. Some knights tried to balance harshness with generosity. They funded repairs, distributed food during famine, or intervened to protect families from extreme punishment. These acts mattered locally, but they did not change the system. They were temporary relief, not resolution. As years passed, the emotional toll of constant authority wore down patience. Anger came faster. Mercy came slower. Knights who had once resisted cruelty sometimes adopted it unconsciously. This was not corruption in the dramatic sense. It was erosion. What made this especially painful was the awareness that failure was personal. If unrest occurred, it was the knight's fault. If peace held, credit went to higher authority. Responsibility flowed downward, recognition upward. This imbalance discouraged reflection. There was no space to question whether the role itself was flawed. Survival required compliance, not analysis. Knights focused on immediate problems, not long-term justice. When knights finally stepped back from active service, these accumulated tensions did not dissolve. They remained as memories and habits. Authority lingered in posture and tone. Suspicion lingered in interaction. Peace, when it came, felt unfamiliar. The world remembers knights as figures of clarity and purpose. The reality was far messier. Knights lived inside contradictions they did not create and could not escape. They were agents of power without control over its direction. This is where the weight of knighthood becomes most apparent. Not in battle, not in legend, but in the long years spent managing conflict without resolution, enforcing order without peace, and carrying responsibility without authority. As we move into the final part of this story, everything narrows. What remains is not history as spectacle, but history as experience. The last piece of this long reflection will bring together the quiet truths that were lived but rarely recorded, and finally answer, without romance or exaggeration, why being a medieval knight was far more burden than blessing. As the life of a medieval knight reached its true end, there was no grand conclusion waiting for most of them. No final charge that tied everything together. No moment where sacrifice suddenly made sense. What remained instead was a long accumulation of ordinary days, strained choices, and expectations that had never loosened their grip. By the final years, many knights no longer thought of themselves as heroes or even warriors. They thought in smaller terms, about keeping land intact long enough to pass it on, about avoiding disputes that could drag their families into ruin, about managing pain quietly so it did not become public weakness. Life narrowed not because ambition faded, but because energy did. The medieval world did not pause to honor this narrowing. Lords still issued demands. Taxes were still collected. Church obligations continued. Social rituals remained rigid. Even as strength declined, the role stayed fixed. Knights were not released from expectation. They were simply expected to endure it more quietly. The most difficult realization often came late. Knights began to see that the values they had been taught to embody were not designed for their benefit. Honor kept them obedient. Loyalty kept them expendable. Reputation kept them silent. These ideals organized society efficiently, but they consumed individuals without concern for what remained afterward. Looking back, many knights understood that moments of genuine meaning had been rare and fragile. A successful mediation that prevented bloodshed. A winter survived without hunger. A child reaching adulthood safely. These moments mattered more than victories, yet they were never celebrated in stories. The violence that defined their public image was often the least meaningful part of their lives. Battle was chaotic, frightening, and brief compared to the years spent preparing for it and recovering from it. What lingered were the consequences, not the glory. Injuries, grudges, fear, and memory followed knights far longer than any triumph. Knighthood promised clarity, but delivered contradiction. Knights were told they were protectors, yet forced to enforce systems that harmed the same people they protected. They were told obedience was virtue, yet punished when obedience created suffering. They were praised for restraint, yet rewarded for force. Living inside these contradictions required constant emotional adjustment. Over time, many knights stopped seeking resolution. They accepted that the role was not meant to be resolved. It was meant to be endured. Endurance became the quiet measure of success. Surviving with reputation intact was considered achievement enough. When death finally came, it rarely answered questions. It arrived through illness, infection, or simple decline. Final rites were performed. Debts were settled if possible. Property passed hands. The body was buried according to status. Life closed without commentary. What survived afterward was not the person, but the image. Armor displayed. Names recorded. Effigies carved. Stories repeated. The rough edges were smoothed away. The human cost disappeared beneath language about honor and service. This is why it truly sucked to be a medieval knight. Not because the life lacked bravery or meaning, but because it demanded everything while acknowledging very little. Knights gave strength, youth, obedience, and often peace of mind in exchange for an identity that belonged more to society than to themselves. They lived inside a role that celebrated sacrifice but offered no protection from it. They were praised more generously in death than supported in life. Their suffering was reframed as virtue, which meant it did not need to be addressed or relieved. Understanding this does not diminish the medieval world. It makes it real. It reminds us that history is not built by symbols, but by people navigating systems larger than themselves, doing the best they can within limits they did not choose. The medieval knight was not a flawless hero or a simple villain. He was a human being shaped early, constrained tightly, and remembered selectively. His life was heavy not because of battle alone, but because of the long, quiet weight of obligation carried every day. If this slower, honest way of telling history helped you see the medieval world differently, take a moment before you drift off to sleep. Leave a comment with your thoughts or simply say you were here. And if you want more long, calm stories that strip away myth and focus on what life was really like, supporting the channel by liking the video or subscribing helps keep these stories coming.